In this chapter, we will talk about the navigation, and at the same time, we will explore the viewport. So to start, let's go over to System, Preferences, and inside of this menu, if you scroll all the way down, you'll notice that under Input, Remapping, there is this remapping form. So just select Remapping, and then go to Mouse Input Presets, and choose Maya. The difference between Maya and Maya Navigation Only is that Maya Navigation Only will not change anything with selections. So for example, while under Maya, what you would do is if you clicked on this, then right click, if you went over your model and held right click, you would have a ray select. With Maya Navigation Only, the selection method is different, and you use different mice buttons to actually select. So that's the only thing it really changes. So in this case, just use Maya. The reason why we will stick with Maya for the duration of this tutorial is because if you get used to using the Maya navigation method, you can also use it in Softimage, you can use it in Cinema, ZBrush has a plugin to use the same method, Mudbox uses the same method, I think Silo uses the same method, I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, I never really had a problem with navigating in it, so I guess it must be. And then there's a plugin also for 3D Studio Max to use the same method. Otherwise, if you don't learn this one method, then you're always going to be learning all the different methods to navigate, and you're gonna start getting all confused and whatnot, and there's always gonna be that time where you have to get up and running, and you're gonna, stumble and fumble. So get used to one. It's not necessarily the best, but it works, and it's almost standard, so to speak. So once we click on this, you will get this pop-up, and by default Maya zoom navigation is set to Alt right click. Would you prefer to utilize Alt left click and middle mouse button instead? Say no. The reason why I say no is because if you use left click and middle click to zoom, right, the way it's going to work is like this. If you hold Alt on your keyboard and then use left click, you're going to tumble. If you use middle click, you will track from side to side or pan, and then using left click and middle click, you will zoom. The reason why I personally don't like that is because I found myself and other people also getting carpal tunnel. So your forearm and your wrist ends up hurting a lot. You're actually having to press these two keys at the same time. You're utilizing more muscle per click, and you end up having a repetitive stress injury. So just say no, and yeah. To navigate, what we do is we hold the Alt keyboard key on the keyboard, and then we use left click. So when you hold Alt and then hold left click and just move your mouse around, you'll notice that I am tumbling around in the viewport. If I keep holding Alt and press middle click on my mouse, I now pan from side to side. If I use right click and hover my mouse over any part of my model, I can now zoom in to see details of that particular part that I'm interested in. The nice thing, of course, is that, if you want to very quickly zoom in on any part, this works beautifully. The other hotkey that you should be interested in also is the G hotkey. So if I hover over anywhere in the viewport and I press G, Modo automatically centers that object without zooming in or out. It just pans it up or left and sets the pivot, the camera pivot or orientation to that location. So now if I Alt left click and I navigate around, you'll notice that I am directly pivoting over that one point. If I hover over here and I press G again, I don't have to click anything on my mouse, I just hover it over to that location and press G. I am now focused on that part of the model. One hotkey that you might want to know about is also, or at least one that I find very useful, is that if you don't feel like zooming in first and then working on something, if you just want to focus on that object straight away, you could, for example, double click on an object and then use the View Fit Selected. this will automatically force this object to be centered and fit into the viewport. I personally like this, the fit selected, to have a hotkey of Alt-A. It makes it very simple and quick to access, because I'm already using the Alt hotkey to navigate around. That way all I have to do is just press Alt and A instead of any other hotkey, and for me that makes it simpler. The way to set that very quickly is to use the feature once. So if I go to fit selected, and then under here, if I hover my mouse over to the command history and I drag and expand that, you'll notice that if I scroll all the way down, fit items in selected viewport. So if I do this and I go to fit selected, so yeah, fit items in selected viewport, I can left click on this, I can right click, map command to key, and now you can choose Alt A and press OK. And now I can collapse that back down, and now whenever I double click on something and press Alt A, I have that option. The other thing that I guess you guys should know is, as far as the viewport is concerned, if you want to change the actual view, or if you want to snap it to a very specific view, then you have to use this button over here. Right now it's set to perspective. If I want it to go to top, I can very easily change it to top, bottom, back, front, and so on. You can also view the camera from the point of view of a light or a camera, which is also very useful. I personally have these set. I have actual hotkeys for all these. So for this I use 1, for this one I use Alt 1, for this one I use, actually no wait, yeah, Alt 1, and then for back I use 2, or rather for front I use 2, and then for back I use Alt 2, and then for right I use 3, and then for left I use Alt 3. And then for perspective I use the tilde key. That's just a personal preference. The next thing is, of course, the shading. So this button, what it does is it controls the way that your model is displayed in the viewport. If I use wireframe, you will see the entire wireframe of the object. Solid makes sure that it's solidly shaded. Vertex Map. This is used for when you're actually painting Vertex Map, or when you're setting up a character. Or whenever you have creases visible and anything like that. If you have any kind of vertex map that has a property on top of the model, this is what vertex map view would be used for. Shaded is just a very simple shading. So now if we go over to the texture shading method, and then I turn off the wireframe, one thing that you'll notice right away is that this is a very flat shaded texture view. So it shows us the actual texture being applied to the model, but there's absolutely no lighting information on this. So that's basically the difference between texture and shaded texture. Shaded texture will actually, imagine how this looked. So you have the shading information, you have the lighting information, you have the specular, the darks and lights and whatnot, the gradients across the object. Imagine if you took this and then multiplied a texture over it, or vice versa. You basically end up with something like this. Then you have Advanced OpenGL. This one actually has a few extra properties. You can display transparencies and all sorts of other effects on there, and normal maps and things like that. And then you have a few extra funky ones, cell shading, reflection. And then RayGL, what it does is it allows you to have to actually render your model inside of your viewport. So with RayGL off, you are just using your basic video card to render the view. So, however, so it's basically going to give you a result that's very similar to what Maya would have or what XSI would have. However, if I click on this button and I go to fast, it's actually going to render it. In this case, not very well. But if I go to full, what you'll notice is that you get a full render out of it. Now, you can change the settings under this. if I go to System Preferences, and then I go to Display, RayGL, and then I start enabling some of these features, it could potentially look better. Make sure this is resolution full and quality finer render. If you want to work a little faster, you might want to set this to draft. The one thing I would pretty much, I wouldn't recommend is actually using half or a quarter resolution, unless all you're doing is lighting. The only reason I say that is because if you go to half, your end result looks very blurry. So under some circumstances you might need it, you might want it, in fact, but as you can see it's getting very, very blurry. Whenever I have full quality, you'll notice that the result is much sharper. I'm actually just going to disable that for now. And then if you are a laptop user, and then there is these transform buttons on the top right of your viewport. So what these first three buttons do is they are used for navigation, and the reason why they exist is because, well, at least partially why they exist is because it makes it a lot easier to use on your laptop. And the reason why it's easier is because if I Alt and left click in my viewport using my mouse, you'll notice that first of all my cursor is moving across on the screen, and eventually if I keep going it's going to hit an end. So I am really constrained to the screen, and at the same time my finger always has to, or imagine my cursor always has to travel across the screen. If I do the same thing under here, under this button, I don't have to hold Alt first of all, I just basically click on this rotational button and I can rotate infinitely or tumble infinitely, and at the same time when I let go of my tool, my cursor remains exactly in the same spot that it was. So that's the one big thing about this, is that imagine if you're working on a laptop and you are tumbling and you want to make it, this far or even further as you're tumbling around. The one thing that might eventually annoy you is the fact that, well, first of all, now your finger's over here, and you might want to select something again, right? In this case, you just rotate as much as you want, and your cursor's right back to the same spot. At the same time, if you use this, you can once again move around, and when I let go, my mouse is back to exactly where I wanted it to be. The one big difference between the zoom is that if I hover over anything and I Alt right click with my mouse, you'll notice that I can zoom wherever I want, as I explained already. But with the with the button zoom here, if I zoom in, it's always to the center of the view. So if I now tumble or pan over here and then I do this again, I'm always going towards the center of the actual viewport and not the not my cursor, because my cursor is always in this location here. The last button that I should mention is this one here, and what this button does is it maximizes the viewport and hides the interface. So if I click on it, you get this result. Of course, at the same time, if I just hit 0 on my number pad, same result. And then you have this button. Now, this gear button is essentially what it now holds a lot of features that used to be under the advanced, or this button right here, in previous versions. So if you now click on this, you'll now notice that drawing and control, visibility, active meshes, and inactive meshes now have, or are rather stored all in one place. If I go to drawing and control, you'll notice that there's a lot of options here for enabling topology mode. So it's a different way to display your viewport. You can change a whole lots of things like show lights, show grid if you want or not. So if I were to now try to disable grid, I can't do it from here. And work plane and things like that. Active mesh is all the settings that deal with the way your mesh is displayed when it's your main selected model. So if I go back to my item list, and I scroll down, you'll notice that this mesh here is visible, and this one I'm going to make visible as well, or at least I'm going to make other models visible as well. Except you'll notice that I haven't selected them. So this is a background mesh, this is a foreground mesh, or rather an active mesh and an inactive mesh. So if I go back into this gear thing here, I go to active mesh, I can actually change the way this thing here is being displayed. So if I go to active mesh and I change it to perhaps just shaded mode, or I change it to wireframe, as you can see, I'm only changing the actual active mesh right now. At the same time, I could change the wireframe color, or to have a wireframe or not altogether. And if I go to inactive mesh, I can actually change it to look exactly like my active mesh, but maybe I might not want to see a wireframe on this object. So now, whenever I switch, you'll now notice that I see a wireframe over the object that is active and no wireframe over the object that's inactive. The other option, I guess, is to do something like this, and is again, go back to inactive meshes and just draw it as a wireframe. This is technically faster because it doesn't have to actually shade any of the polygons, so it just renders only the edges. Oh, one last thing. The one last thing that I might want to mention is that while you're navigating, this little gizmo orients, or it's always on the lower left corner of your viewport, and it gives you a good orientation of which way you are facing in 3D space. This square here tells you exactly where the work plane is being snapped to at any given time. So if I go into the cog once again, and I go into visibility work plane, you'll now notice that this right here, the Y and Z, is exactly which axis the work plane is being snapped to. If I keep navigating this way, you'll notice that as soon as this widget here, the work plane snaps to there, it actually snaps in 3D space as well. So if you have your work plane turned off, this is actually a very useful tool to use while modeling. So I can actually turn off the work plane altogether, and let's just say I am making a cube, right? So as I'm navigating and I look at this widget, this thing here, I can make a cube, and I know for a fact that if I start drawing it, I start drawing it on this axis right here, and then I can pull it out forward. If I, however, navigate to a point like this, and I start drawing it, I am no longer drawing it on the Y and Z, or Y or X. I am now drawing it on Z and X, and I have to pull it upwards. Same thing if I keep navigating this way. I am now drawing it on, if I start a new one, I am drawing it on Y and Z, and I have to pull it outwards this way. So just a little thing I thought I'd throw in there. Sometimes when people are using or are new to Modo, one thing that they find that's turned on by default is that trackball rotation is turned on. If you want the trackball rotation to be off, just look around in this menu and you'll notice that under the drawing and control, you'll have oscillate, trackball rotation no or yes, and orbit selected. So let's explain these in some brief detail. So if I go over to trackball rotation and I set it to yes, right away you'll notice that I can navigate to some very flexible angles. This is pretty much like being in space where there is no up. A lot of Maya users or a lot of 3D Studio Max users don't necessarily like this very much. So just go back to the gear here, to the settings, turn trackball rotation off or no. And now whenever you tumble around, you'll notice that the model is always facing up. The other thing that you might want to also turn on, it's up to you, but it's orbit selected. So as soon as I select anything, I automatically tumble around that part of the model. So if I select these, I now tumble around here. So this is my automatic focus. If I deselect, it goes back to the center of the viewport or object. And notice that I am once again tumbling around the actual object. The reason why this is because Modo by default, if you have nothing selected, then everything is selected. So imagine if I select these faces here, then these faces, or these polygons, are actually being selected. If I have nothing selected, imagine that Modo is selecting every single polygon like this, except without visually displaying it to you.